Good morning and welcome to the Morning Scoop for Thursday, January 7th. This is your daily Buckeye fix. I'm Tom Orr. The national championship game against Alabama is in 4 days. The game against Michigan in 324 days. We got a chance to talk to some Alabama players yesterday to preview the national title game, and for the most part, they were pretty complimentary about the Buckeyes. That doesn't really mean anything since their primary goal is always to not give anyone any bulletin board material, and for the most part, they succeeded. But Mac Jones said this Ohio State team was going to be the best defense they faced all season. After the Sugar Bowl, that suddenly seems a little less crazy than it might have a couple weeks ago. My guest today is Buckeye Scoop's X's and O's guru, Ross Fulton. He just wrote about that Ohio State defense and why it was so effective against Clemson. Ross, thank you for joining me.
Happy to, Tom.
Well, one thing that was interesting to me was that Ohio State really didn't go to nickel very often against Clemson. I think going into the game, the assumption was that they probably would because Clemson was probably going to have to throw the ball. And then they were very one-dimensional on offense, Clemson was. And so it seemed like that would be a very obvious move to go to more nickel, and they didn't. So what did they do instead and why?
Yeah, for anyone who follows me on Twitter, when I'm a bit more animated during games, you will see that I'm usually banging the drum for them to play more nickel than they do. I think they did end up probably playing it a third of the snaps against Clemson just because the last 2 or 3 drives of the fourth quarter, they were pretty much exclusively in nickel. But before that, they pretty much only played it on third down, despite the fact that Clemson was a spread offense using at least 3 wide receivers and never really had much of a chance to run the football inside. But Ohio State is pretty set in their philosophy and definitely prefers to keep 3 linebackers on the field as much as they can. First and foremost, to stop the run. They obviously also personnel-wise have a lot of good experienced linebackers right now. So I guess it's not a surprise that they want them on the field, but within that scheme, they essentially used a light box or a lighter box than they normally would. And so, for obviously everyone is pretty familiar now seeing Ohio State line up with a single high safety pre-snap. And they did not do that against Clemson. They instead lined up in a split safeties. They still ended up playing mostly single high cover 3, but they'd have one of those safeties rotate down at the snap instead. And to compensate for that, because then, if you have 2 safeties back, you can't have someone covered up on the slot receiver. So they wind out their linebackers, especially the Sam, Justin Hilliard, outside of the tight end, but also Pete Werner, particularly if Travis Etienne or Ben was to his side. And by doing that, they essentially, and then I should add, the third thing they did was use sort of like a boxing or squeeze technique from the defensive end, where the defensive end really sort of stayed put and essentially caught, if there was a puller, for instance, they essentially caught them. And the purpose was to give Trevor Lawrence inside run reads, essentially. So, if you're running, a zone read, or if you're running a run combined with an RPO, Ohio State wanted to encourage them to have to run it and not throw it. And because, again, we're working off the premise that Ohio State's very good at stopping the run. So they prefer those teams running against them than being in space. And so those all work together Clemson did have to run a lot. Ohio State, when you run read plays, you still have to block the remaining guys. They were, especially defensive tackles, were consistently making plays. And then that put the linebackers in a space where they could either, take away Travis Etienne on speed options or pitches, or they're basically sitting in some of those RPO throwing lanes. So it doesn't present an appealing picture to the quarterback to pull and throw the football.
Well, one thing Mac Jones did say on Wednesday was that this is not a super complicated scheme for Ohio State. So, and that's something that I think in the past we've heard Ohio State talk about simplifying the scheme, that one of the issues in 2018 was it was too complex and that was slowing them down in terms of how quickly they could play. So does the not super complicated scheme mean that they are easy to attack for a team as talented as Alabama? Does it mean that Ohio State can play fast and make it harder to move the ball against? All of the above? Like this feels like this is the eternal question with the Ohio State defense.
Yep. Yes is the answer to both. I would certainly agree with Mac Jones. It is a very simple scheme, particularly when you compare it to Clemson or what they'll see from Alabama, where Nick Saban will run every coverage known to man. They'll mix cover 3 with a bunch of different kinds of quarters coverages. They'll run 4 down, they'll run 3 down. He invents, he's got his mitt front. I mean, he's Nick Saban. He's known for everything. The trade-off is like what Ohio State did to Clemson, and what Alabama's been hurt with in the past is tempo, because you're trying to get all those different calls onto the field. If you shift and motion around, guys have to, it depends what they're playing, you can get caught out of position. And so Ohio State, you pretty much, especially this year, know you're going to get a lot of cover three on standard downs. Cover three has been around forever. There's plenty of pass plays that work against it. And, even with Clemson, they completed a bunch of passes underneath. I mean, as you and I are both aware, there are plenty of Ohio State fans that get very upset when passes are being completed in front of Sean Wade. And, a lot of those are not his fault. I mean, he's playing the coverage he's assigned to play, but Ohio State's willing to give those up. And, for Ohio State against Alabama, just like we were talking about Clemson, the hope is, cover three is good against run pass options. You're going to have those lanes filled up. You got people covered up. And so the hope is by keeping it simple, playing fast, they're able to essentially minimize that, because that's just where Alabama really, really hurts people and creates explosive plays.
But you touched on this a little bit earlier with the safeties and how Ohio State was leaving two guys back, but not leaving two guys back. So it seemed like that made life a little tougher on Trevor Lawrence. Can you explain that in a little more detail, like exactly what they were doing and why they were doing it with those safeties?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple things. It's I laugh because even every team that plays cover three, Pete Carroll and the Seahawks, we talked about how sort of the scheme's adapted from this. I mean, everyone at least aligns in two high safeties so that the quarterback does not know where your cover three rotation is coming from, which safety is going down. So that's one thing. I mean, it makes it a little bit harder on the quarterback, so he can't automatically know what kind of cover three you're playing. The other thing is, again, Clemson, and you'll see this from Alabama too. They like to use a lot of like the fly sweep motion, or they'll do, orbit motion to throw screens. And so one thing that hurt Ohio State last year, even though they were better in the secondary, is when teams would use that motion, they'd have to sort of rock and roll. You'd have a corner go back to deep safety, and then Jordan Fuller would have to come up as a corner. And so by keeping two deep safeties, it makes it much easier to adjust to that motion, because if pre-snap, the slot receiver was on let's say, so Josh Proctor plays to the wide field and Marcus Williams to the boundary when they do that. And let's say if the, pre-snap, if the slot receiver was on Proctor's side and he was probably going to come down, but then that guy goes in motion, all they have to do now is Williams is going to go down, Proctor's going to become the deep safety. And so it's much easier to adjust. And then, as I said, the third thing is it sort of widens out the defense in general to handle things on the edge.
And, the outside linebackers also played a pretty big role in the pass game against Clemson. Can you explain what they did with them, and if that's something that they can do against Alabama, with the Tide having potentially a much better run game than Clemson does?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, by being out of the box, it makes it easier to sort of play us, particularly on the edge against, wide receiver screen plays. Alabama, but Clemson runs them as well. They're the RPO that everyone I'm sure has in the back of their mind is seeing Devontae Smith catch what sort of looks like a slant route. I mean, they call it a glance. Basically, when someone comes up and they throw it, and he's off to the races. And so if those guys are in the alley, they're at least sitting in the throwing lanes to start with. So it sort of detaches them somewhat from playing the run immediately, and so that they could be more pass first. And again, it gives the quarterback that pass first read. And so, I agree that Alabama is a better run team. However, I think they're going to have to do the same things against Alabama, because they have to rely on the fact, I mean, they've been so good against the run this year that they can still win those battles up front. And I think they have to take the trade-off of, if they give up a 4 and 5 yard run, so be it, versus, Alabama running run pass options on them all the time, because that's where the explosive plays come from Alabama. They have to at least earn it.
That's going to be so interesting, because that goes completely counter to what the Ohio State defensive philosophy always is, which is stop the run first. Don't let them run. That's the first focus all the time, but also don't give up big plays. So there's a little bit of a conflict there. It seems like that's going to be really interesting to see how that shakes out. One of those outside linebackers who was really solid, it seemed like, was Justin Hilliard. Would you look for them to keep playing him at Sam, and maybe Baron Browning being more of an edge rusher against Alabama?
Yeah, I don't see how you take Hilliard off the field the way he's played in the last two games. To me, I mean, no offense to Browning, who has his own skill set, but Hilliard's really good in space on those plays. Like, there are a few times where he shed the block and then made a tackle on a screen or on an option, which again lets them play. It's sort of like what Ohio State did with Darren when they won the national championship. Like if you needed a linebacker that can play in space like that, then you don't need to go to nickel, and you have the advantage of he's going to be much better at shedding blocks and making tackles. And so, I personally would use Browning as more of an edge rusher. I think, they've been down defensive ends in the past. Zach Harrison didn't play last week. And so, I think that, and we saw Browning's skill coming off the edge. And so, in nickel situations, at the least, I would use him in a pass rushing role.
And one other player who has come on pretty strong in the last couple of weeks and played pretty well in a pretty big time spot against Clemson was Lathan Ransom, for true freshman safety. He was someone our insiders have been talking up a lot in the lead up to the Sugar Bowl. And then it seemed like he had a really solid game, and that's, doubly true. You can consider he's a true freshman thrust into that kind of spot.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously when people want to point back to the Indiana game a lot in terms of the defensive backs giving up big plays, but the defensive backfield's been, made up quite a bit, and things have really been stabilized between, I would say, putting in Josh Proctor as one safety, moving Marcus Williamson to more of a traditional safety role from sort of filling that slot corner hybrid role, and then using Ransom as the nickel. And I think he does a good job there. He did well, and they did play quite a bit of man coverage from nickel, and so he handled that well as he just shows good instincts in zone. So I don't think you're going to call their secondary a shutdown unit, but I think that they've stabilized the situation. And as Ryan Day talked about after the game, they're at least, when they're giving up completions, they're tackling, they're keeping the ball in front, and they're not giving up those big hits.
This Alabama offense is about as pick your poison an offense as you could possibly imagine. Tony Gerdman and I were talking on the episode of Buckeye Weekly we recorded last night about the fact that this is probably the best offense either of us remember Ohio State ever facing, just in terms of just skill everywhere and really, really top level skill everywhere. It sounds like you would, if you were in charge of the Ohio State defense, worry about limiting Devontae Smith, not giving up a ton of big plays. And then if Najee Harris gets, runs for 100 and something yards, that you would rather have that than Devontae Smith having a 200 something yard receiving day. I mean, is there a stat that you would look at, for an individual player that would make you think, if Devontae Smith is under so many yards, or if Najee Harris is under so many yards per carry, that you would think, okay, that's probably a very good indication that Ohio State has a very good chance to win this game?
Yeah, I mean, I actually more of in terms of a team stat, I would look for how many plays over 20 yards Ohio State allows. I mean, I think that has to be low, whether it's through running or passing. I frankly would also, if I was Ohio State, like to see Najee Harris carries up at least in the 20s, because again, that means you're giving Alabama the key on run pass options to give the football off. I think I would rather take my chances at Ohio State stopping the run than having Devontae Smith in space a bunch. And then I think when you're third down, you have to find a way to make Mac Jones uncomfortable. I mean, in terms of, you're talking about the skill talent, I mean, he's a very good quarterback. He's not Trevor Lawrence, and they made Trevor Lawrence uncomfortable by using some pressure in his face. As Clemson had to pass more, the defensive line made an impact. And so, they need that kind of performance again, because Alabama is so good running screens and RPOs. You just don't see Mac Jones have to be moved off his spot a lot. And so they're going to have to try to make him a little uncomfortable.
Well, Ross has written about the Ohio State offense against Clemson, the Ohio State defense against Clemson. Now got a coming up pretty soon at BuckeyeScoop.com. Going to have so what does it mean for Alabama article. So you want to give people a little sense what it might mean for Alabama?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I think a lot of this is what we've been talking about. And so, I'm going to discuss both in terms of, what Alabama does defensively, which, I sort of touched on a lot earlier, which is a lot, in terms of then, how Ohio State can look to attack them. And then similarly, look at how the Ohio State defense, first and foremost, as I, keep hitting on here, has to limit run pass options. And then, when they do throw them, tackle in space. And, it's Tough Borland sort of touched on it earlier this week, when basically they have to keep it in front of them and push the ball to the middle of the field. And that's sort of like, Pete Carroll uses the term the cover 3 kill zone. And that's what they want to funnel it, try to make the tackle and try to limit big plays.
Well, you can find all of Ross's work at buckeyescoop.com. You can also find all of the rest of our incredible content at that site as well. We have had some threads on our insiders board this week that have had 100 and something thousand views for just stuff that Nevada Buck has reported from inside practices and what's going on and sort of what to expect. There's a lot of questions about what to expect right now. They are all getting answered on our Ask the Insiders board at buckeyescoop.com. If you are not a member yet, what are you waiting for? The national championship game is 4 days away, and there's plenty to talk about. It will help, I promise. It will help speed that time along until kickoff time on Monday night. So you can find that all at buckeyescoop.com. Also, you can kill some time by listening to some of our great podcasts. We do have them on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify. Just search Buckeye Scoop to find all of those. You can subscribe right there to make sure you don't miss an episode. Also, leave us a 5-star rating and review while you're there as well. Thank you guys for listening. Have a great day. We will talk to you tomorrow.